I watched from across the community center as a single father in worn work clothes was about to be humiliated in front of dozens of families. His 7-year-old daughter clutched her birthday money, ready to donate it to charity, when 3 wealthy women decided to make them the target of their cruelty. What happened next left everyone speechless, because sometimes the person you underestimate the most is exactly the one who will shock you beyond belief. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn sunlight filtered through the large windows of the Oakwood Community Center, illuminating the bustling crowd that had gathered for the annual Fall Harvest Charity Drive. Families moved between colorfully decorated booths. Children ran between tables laden with baked goods, and the sound of laughter mixed with the gentle hum of conversation. The event had become a beloved tradition in this affluent suburb, drawing residents together for what was supposed to be a celebration of community spirit and generosity. Robert Mitchell stood near the entrance with his daughter Sophie, both of them taking in the scene with quiet observation. At 36, Robert carried himself with the careful posture of a man who had learned to navigate spaces where he didn't quite belong. His clothes told the story of his circumstances: dark jeans that had been mended at the knee, a navy blue sweater that was clean but clearly had seen many washings, and work boots that bore the honest scars of manual labor. His brown hair was neatly combed, though it needed a trim he couldn't quite afford, and his hands showed the calluses and small cuts that came from his job at the local warehouse. Sophie bounced beside him with the irrepressible energy of a 7-year-old, her blonde curls escaping from the ponytail he had carefully arranged that morning. Her red dress was her favorite, though it had been purchased from a thrift store 6 months earlier and was already growing a bit short for her rapidly lengthening legs. In her small hands, she held a white envelope that she had decorated with stickers and drawn hearts, her name written in careful block letters across the front. Inside that envelope was $55, every penny Robert had managed to save for Sophie's upcoming 8th birthday celebration. The money represented weeks of careful planning and sacrifice. Robert had taken on extra weekend shifts, skipped his usual coffee on the way to work, and walked the 3 miles home instead of taking the bus, all to accumulate enough for a small party. Sophie had been planning her celebration for months, talking excitedly about the butterfly cake she wanted and the games they could play with her few friends from school. But when she had seen the flyer advertising the charity drive for homeless families, something had shifted in her young heart. Robert remembered the conversation they had shared just 3 days earlier, sitting at their small kitchen table while Sophie worked on her homework. She had looked up from her coloring book and asked him about the families who didn't have homes. When he had gently explained that some children didn't have warm beds or enough food, Sophie had grown very quiet. The next morning, she had presented him with her envelope and announced that she wanted to give her birthday money to help those families instead. Robert had tried to dissuade her, explaining that they could find other ways to help, that her birthday was special and deserved to be celebrated. But Sophie had been adamant, with the fierce determination that only children possess when they believe something is truly important. Finally, Robert had agreed, his heart swelling with pride, even as it broke a little for the party that wouldn't happen. Now, as they made their way toward the donation tables, Robert noticed the subtle looks from other families. This wasn't their usual community. They lived in a small apartment complex across town, and Sophie attended the public school rather than the private academy that most of these children called home. Robert worked hard to provide for Sophie, but his warehouse job barely covered their basic expenses, leaving little room for the kind of lifestyle that seemed effortless for the families around them. Near the main donation table, a group of well-dressed women had gathered, their conversation animated and their voices carrying across the space. At the center of the group stood Victoria Blackwell, a woman whose platinum blonde hair was styled to perfection and whose designer outfit probably cost more than Robert made in a month. Her jewelry caught the light with every gesture, and her voice carried the particular confidence that came from never having to worry about money. "I just think it's important to maintain certain standards at these events," Victoria was saying to her companions. "We work so hard to create something meaningful for our community, and then people who clearly don't belong here show up and dilute the whole experience." Her friend Jennifer nodded in agreement, adjusting her expensive handbag. "Exactly. I mean, look around. You can tell who really belongs here and who's just here to see what they can get for free." The third woman, Amanda, glanced meaningfully toward Robert and Sophie. "Some people have no shame. They'll bring their children to these events just to take advantage of other people's generosity." Robert felt his cheeks burn as he realized they were talking about him and Sophie, but he kept his expression neutral. He had faced this kind of judgment before, and he had learned that responding usually only made things worse. Instead, he knelt down to Sophie's level and helped her straighten her dress. "Remember what we talked about, sweetheart," he said quietly. "Your gift is going to help families who really need it. That's something to be proud of." Sophie nodded solemnly, her grip tightening on her envelope. "Will the homeless kids get warm beds because of my birthday money, Daddy?" "Some of them will," Robert assured her. "And that's going to make your birthday even more special, don't you think?" They approached the donation table together, where a volunteer with a kind smile greeted them warmly. "Hello there. Are you here to make a donation today?" "Yes," Sophie said proudly, holding up her envelope. "I saved my birthday money to help the homeless families." The volunteer's expression softened with genuine warmth. "That's incredibly generous of you, sweetheart." "What's your name?" "Sophie Mitchell," she replied. "And this is my daddy, Robert." That's when Victoria appeared beside them, her voice cutting through their conversation like a blade. "Excuse me," she said to the volunteer, "but I think there might be some confusion here." The volunteer looked up with surprise. "I'm sorry." Victoria's gaze moved dismissively over Robert and Sophie. "I believe this gentleman and his daughter are here for assistance, not to make donations. We should direct them to the proper table." Robert felt something cold settle in his stomach, but he kept his voice steady. "Ma'am, we're here to make a donation. My daughter saved her birthday money for this event." Victoria's laugh was sharp and condescending. "Birthday money, really?" She looked Robert up and down with obvious disdain. "Sir, it's quite clear from your appearance that you're here because you need help, not because you have anything meaningful to contribute." Other families had begun to notice the commotion, and Robert could feel their eyes on him. Sophie pressed closer to his side, confusion evident on her young face as she sensed the tension in the air. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Robert said carefully. "Sophie has $55 that she wants to donate to help homeless families." Jennifer had joined Victoria now, her voice equally mocking. $55? From a child whose father obviously can't even afford proper clothes. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Please don't insult our intelligence. Amanda stepped forward as well, creating a semicircle of judgment around Robert and Sophie. "This is exactly what we were talking about. People who clearly need charity themselves trying to participate as if they're actual donors. It's embarrassing for everyone involved." The conversation around them had died down as more people turned to watch the confrontation. Robert could see pity in some faces, curiosity in others, but too many reflected the same dismissive judgment as the three women confronting him. He wanted to take Sophie's hand and leave, to spare both of them further humiliation, but his daughter's grip on her envelope remained firm. "Daddy," Sophie whispered, looking up at him with wide, confused eyes, "why are the ladies being mean? Don't they want to help the homeless kids?" Robert knelt down to her level, his voice gentle despite the anger building in his chest. "Sometimes, sweetheart, people make mistakes about what's important, but your heart is in the right place. And that's what matters." Victoria wasn't finished. "Really, this charade has gone on long enough. Security should escort people like you out before you make an even bigger scene." Or did the words hit Robert like physical blows? and he could see the hurt beginning to show on Sophie's face as she slowly understood that these women were being cruel to her and her father. He started to stand, ready to take Sophie and leave with whatever dignity he could manage. That's when something inside Robert shifted. He had spent years accepting this kind of treatment, swallowing his pride for Sophie's sake, letting people make assumptions about his worth based on his appearance. But watching his daughter's generous heart being mocked, seeing her confusion and hurt, ignited something fierce within him. Robert stood to his full height and looked directly at Victoria. "You know what, ma'am? You're absolutely right about one thing. There is someone here who doesn't belong." Victoria smirked triumphantly. Finally, some honesty. "But it's not who you think," Robert continued, his voice carrying a new edge that made several people in the crowd lean in to listen. "Sophie, sweetheart, can you tell these ladies what I do for work?" Sophie looked up at him with confusion, but answered obediently. "You work really hard at the big building with all the boxes, Daddy." Robert nodded. "That's right. I work at Mitchell Distribution Center." He paused, letting the name sink in. "And Victoria, since you seem so concerned about who belongs at community events, maybe you can tell me who you think owns that building." Victoria's confident expression began to waver slightly. That's not relevant to—" "Actually, it's completely relevant," Robert said, his voice growing stronger. "Because the Mitchell Distribution Center, along with the Mitchell Foundation that sponsors this very event, was founded by my grandfather. The building where I work 60 hours a week isn't just where I'm employed. It's the business my family built from nothing." The crowd had gone completely silent now, everyone straining to hear Robert's words. Victoria's face was beginning to pale, and her friends had taken small steps backward. "You see," Robert continued, "when my father died 5 years ago, I inherited a choice. I could sell everything and live comfortably off the proceeds, or I could keep the business running and preserve the jobs of the 300 families who depend on it. I chose to keep working, to stay close to the operation, to understand every aspect of what we do." He looked down at Sophie, who was watching him with wide eyes. "My daughter doesn't know that the reason we live in a small apartment isn't because we can't afford better. It's because every extra dollar goes back into the business, into maintaining jobs, into supporting the very families that events like this are designed to help." Robert reached into his back pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. From it he extracted not cash, but a folded piece of paper. He handed it to the volunteer at the donation table, who opened it with shaking hands. "That's a check for $25,000, Robert said calmly. "The same amount the Mitchell Foundation donates to this event every year. The same amount I've been contributing anonymously since I took over the business." The volunteer's gasp was audible to everyone nearby, and she held up the check so others could see the amount. A murmur of shock rippled through the crowd. "But here's the thing," Robert continued, his gaze moving back to Victoria and her companions. "Sophie doesn't know about any of that. To her, I'm just her daddy who works hard and sometimes comes home tired. And when she decided to give up her birthday party to help homeless families, she wasn't thinking about foundations or donations or tax write-offs. She was thinking about children who are cold and hungry." He knelt down and gently took Sophie's envelope from her hands. "So when my 7-year-old daughter wants to add her $55 to that $25,000, when she wants to sacrifice something precious to her because she believes it's the right thing to do, that makes her contribution more valuable than all the rest combined." Robert stood and handed Sophie's envelope to the volunteer as well. "Because unlike some people here, Sophie understands that the worth of a gift isn't measured by its size, it's measured by the love and sacrifice behind it." The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria, Jennifer, and Amanda stood frozen, their earlier arrogance completely evaporated. Around them, the crowd began to murmur, some people openly staring at the 3 women with expressions of disgust and disapproval. Robert wasn't finished. "You know what the really sad part is? Sophie was excited to come here today. She wanted to meet other kids who cared about helping people. She thought this would be a place where kindness mattered more than appearances." His voice carried across the silent room. Instead, she got to watch 3 adults mock her generosity and try to humiliate her father, because we don't look like we belong in your world. He looked directly at Victoria. But here's what you don't understand. Sophie and I don't want to belong in a world where people are judged by their clothes instead of their character. We'd rather be in a world where a little girl's birthday money matters as much as a CEO's tax-deductible donation. Robert reached into his wallet again and pulled out a business card, handing it to Victoria. That's my card. Robert Mitchell, owner and CEO of Mitchell Industries. On Monday morning, you'll probably want to call your husband and suggest he update his resume, because I can guarantee that someone with your values doesn't work for a company with mine. Victoria stared at the card with growing horror as she realized the implications. Her husband worked in middle management at one of Mitchell Industries' subsidiary companies. "Daddy," Sophie said quietly, tugging on Robert's sleeve, "are you famous?" Robert knelt down and pulled her into a gentle hug. "No, sweetheart. I'm just your daddy who loves you very much and is very proud of your kind heart." The crowd began to move again, but the energy in the room had completely transformed. People approached Robert and Sophie with genuine warmth now, thanking Sophie for her generosity and expressing admiration for Robert's dedication to his community and his workers. The volunteer at the donation table, still clutching both the check and Sophie's envelope, looked up at Robert with tears in her eyes. "Mr. Mitchell, I had no idea. The foundation has helped so many families over the years." "That's the point," Robert replied gently. "Helping people shouldn't be about recognition or praise. It should be about doing what's right because it's right." As the afternoon continued, word of what had happened spread throughout the event. People who had initially looked at Robert and Sophie with judgment now approached them with respect and admiration. Children came up to Sophie to tell her how cool they thought her donation was, and parents thanked Robert for the example he was setting. Victoria, Jennifer, and Amanda had quietly slipped away, their earlier confidence replaced by shame and the growing realization of how badly they had misjudged the situation. Later, as Robert and Sophie prepared to leave, the event organizer approached them with a warm smile. "Mr. Mitchell, I wanted to thank you personally, not just for the foundation's donation, but for the lesson you taught all of us today." Robert shook his head. "The lesson came from Sophie, not from me. She's the one who reminded us all what generosity really looks like." As they walked to their car, Sophie skipped beside him, her earlier confusion replaced by excitement about the families their combined donations would help. "Daddy, will the homeless kids really get warm beds now?" "They will, sweetheart. Thanks to your big heart, a lot of families are going to have a better winter." Sophie was quiet for a moment, then looked up at him seriously. "Daddy, why didn't you tell those mean ladies who you were right away?" Robert stopped walking and knelt down to her level. "Because, Sophie, I wanted to see what kind of people they really were. I wanted to know if they would be kind to us when they thought we were just regular people who needed help." "And they weren't kind," Sophie observed. "No, they weren't, but that taught us something important, didn't it?" Sophie nodded thoughtfully. "That being nice is more important than being rich." "Exactly. And that the most important thing about a person isn't what they have. It's how they treat other people." The story of what happened that day spread far beyond the community center. Local news picked up the story, not focusing on Robert's wealth or business success, but on Sophie's generous heart and the lesson about judging people by their appearance rather than their character. Robert never changed his routine. He continued working alongside his employees, continued living modestly, and continued teaching Sophie that true worth came from kindness and hard work, not from bank accounts or social status. The Mitchell Foundation established a new program called Sophie's Fund, specifically designed to help families facing temporary hardships. But more importantly, the events of that day became a turning point for many people who witnessed them, a reminder that assumptions about others often say more about ourselves than about the people we're judging. And every year on Sophie's birthday, instead of throwing a big party, She and Robert would visit the families helped by their foundation, sharing cake and celebrating not just another year of Sophie's life, but another year of making a difference in the lives of others. The three women who had tried to humiliate them learned their own lessons. Victoria's husband did indeed lose his job, though Robert later helped him find position elsewhere after the man sincerely apologized and demonstrated genuine change in his attitudes. The experience became a catalyst for all three women to examine their own prejudices and eventually become advocates for treating all people with dignity and respect. The story lived on, not as a tale of revenge or comeuppance, but as proof that true character reveals itself not in how we treat those who can help us, but in how we treat those who we think cannot. The revelation that had just unfolded at the donation table sent shockwaves through the community center, but Victoria Blackwell was not ready to accept defeat. Her face had gone from pale to a dangerous shade of red as she processed what Robert had just revealed. The business card trembled in her manicured fingers as she read and reread the name, printed in simple black letters. Robert Mitchell, CEO, Mitchell Industries. Victoria's mind raced as she tried to reconcile the man standing before her in worn work clothes with the name she recognized from newspaper headlines and Chamber of Commerce meetings. Mitchell Industries was one of the largest employers in the region, known for its ethical business practices and generous community contributions. The realization that she had just publicly humiliated the very man who signed her husband's paychecks should have been enough to send her into immediate damage control mode. But instead, it ignited something darker within her. "This is impossible," Victoria said loudly, her voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "Anyone can print a business card. This is clearly some kind of elaborate scam." Jennifer and Amanda, who had been backing away from the confrontation, stopped in their tracks. They exchanged uncertain glances, torn between their loyalty to Victoria and their growing suspicion that they had made a terrible mistake. Robert remained calm, his arm protectively around Sophie's shoulders as she pressed closer to his side. The little girl could sense the tension escalating, though she didn't fully understand why the pretty lady was still being mean to her daddy, even after he had tried to explain everything. "Ma'am," Robert said quietly, "I think we've had enough drama for one day. Sophie and I came here to make a donation, which we've done. I see no reason to continue this conversation." But Victoria stepped closer, her designer heels clicking on the polished floor. "Oh no, we're not done here. You can't just waltz in here with your little performance and expect everyone to believe this ridiculous story." She turned to address the crowd that had gathered around them, her voice rising with indignation. "Think about it, people. Does this man look like a CEO to you? Look at his clothes, look at his hands. This is obviously someone who's trying to con us with fake documents and made-up stories." A murmur of uncertainty rippled through the onlookers. While many had been moved by Robert's earlier words, Victoria's challenge planted seeds of doubt. After all, he certainly didn't look like any CEO they had ever seen. His calloused hands and worn clothing seemed to contradict the image of corporate success they were accustomed to. Margaret Henderson, the event coordinator, stepped forward with a worried expression. She had been watching the confrontation unfold with growing concern, knowing that whatever was happening here would reflect on the entire charity drive. "Perhaps we could resolve this quietly," Margaret suggested diplomatically, "if there's been some kind of misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding," Victoria interrupted sharply. "This man is running some kind of scam, and I won't stand by and watch him manipulate people's emotions with fake stories about his daughter's birthday money." Sophie looked up at her father with wide, frightened eyes. "Daddy, why is the lady saying mean things about my birthday money? I really did save it." Robert knelt down to Sophie's level, his voice gentle and reassuring. "I know you did, sweetheart. Some people just have trouble believing in kindness when they see it." Victoria seized on this moment, her voice becoming even more aggressive. "See, he's using the child as a prop in his con game. This is disgusting. Someone needs to call security and have them removed before they steal from the actual donations. The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Several people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to believe. The volunteer at the donation table clutched the check and Sophie's envelope uncertainly, looking between Robert and Victoria as if hoping someone would provide clarity. Robert stood slowly, his jaw tightening with barely controlled anger. Throughout his life, he had endured mockery about his appearance, assumptions about his intelligence, and dismissal of his capabilities. But watching someone attack his daughter's innocent generosity pushed him beyond his usual patience. "Mrs. Blackwell," Robert said, his voice carrying a new edge that made several people in the crowd step back. "I gave you my business card and tried to end this civilly. But since you seem determined to make a spectacle of my daughter's charity, let me make something crystal clear." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his cell phone, a simple device that looked several years old. "I'm going to make one phone call. After that call, you'll have all the verification you need about who I am and what I do." Victoria laughed harshly. "Oh, please, what are you going to do?" "Call your friend to pretend to be your secretary." Robert's thumb moved across his phone's screen with practiced efficiency. The crowd watched in tense silence as he held the device to his ear and waited for someone to answer. "Karen, it's Robert. I'm sorry to bother you on a Saturday, but I need you to do something for me." His voice was calm, but carried an undertone of authority that hadn't been there before. "I'm at the Oakwood Community Center, and there's been a situation. Can you please contact Channel 7 and ask them to send someone down here? Tell them there's a story about corporate responsibility and community charity that they might find interesting." Victoria's confident expression began to waver as she listened to Robert's side of the conversation. "Yes, the same center where we hold the annual foundation event. Actually, Mrs. Blackwell here has some concerns about the legitimacy of our donation, so I thought it might be good to have some media present to document everything properly." Robert's eyes never left Victoria's face as he spoke. "And Karen, please contact the board members and ask them to meet us here within the hour. We may need to discuss some personnel changes." He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. The silence that followed was deafening. "You just called the local news?" Jennifer whispered, her face pale with dawning horror. "And my board of directors," Robert confirmed. "If Mrs. Blackwell wants verification of my identity and position, she'll have it, along with a very public explanation of why she felt the need to humiliate a 7-year-old girl who wanted to donate her birthday money to charity." Victoria's mouth opened and closed soundlessly as the full implications of what was happening began to sink in. If Robert really was who he claimed to be, then her husband's job was in serious jeopardy. But more than that, her behavior was about to be broadcast to the entire community, possibly beyond. Amanda grabbed Victoria's arm, her voice urgent and frightened. "Victoria, maybe we should just apologize and leave. This has gone too far." But Victoria shook her off, her pride and anger overriding her common sense. "No, I refuse to be intimidated by this obvious fraud. When the news crew gets here, they'll expose him for what he really is." Sophie tugged on Robert's sleeve, her young voice cutting through the adult tension. "Daddy, are the people on TV going to talk about my birthday money?" Robert picked up his daughter, holding her close as he answered. "They might, sweetheart. Is that okay with you?" Sophie considered this seriously, then nodded. "If it helps more kids get warm beds, then it's okay." Her innocent response sent a wave of emotion through the crowd. Even some of those who had been uncertain about Robert's identity were moved by the child's consistent focus on helping others. Margaret Henderson approached Robert with obvious nervousness. "Mr. Mitchell, if you really are who you say you are, perhaps we could handle this matter privately. I'm sure we can work out any misunderstandings without involving the media." Robert's expression softened slightly as he looked at the worried event coordinator. "Margaret, I appreciate your concern, but this stopped being about misunderstandings the moment Mrs. Blackwell accused me of running a scam and using my daughter as a prop. Some lines, once crossed, require public consequences." Victoria overheard this exchange and felt a chill of real fear for the first time. You can't destroy my family over a simple disagreement, she said, her voice losing some of its earlier venom. A simple disagreement? Robert repeated, his tone incredulous. Mrs. Blackwell, you publicly humiliated my daughter, questioned her generosity, accused me of fraud, and suggested that we should be escorted out by security. That's not a disagreement, that's character assassination. He shifted Sophie in his arms so he could look Victoria directly in the eye. But here's what you don't understand. This isn't about destroying your family. This is about protecting mine and every other family that might face the same treatment from people who think their wealth gives them the right to judge others. The sound of car doors slamming in the parking lot drew everyone's attention toward the windows. Through the glass, they could see a news van with Channel 7's logo pulling up to the curb, followed by several expensive sedans. "Daddy," Sophie whispered, "there are lots of cars coming." "I know, sweetheart. Some of Daddy's friends from work are coming to visit." Victoria watched the arrival of the news crew with growing panic. Her earlier bravado was crumbling as the reality of her situation became undeniable. "Please," she said quietly to Robert, "can't we work this out? I may have been hasty in my judgments." "Hasty?" Robert's voice carried a note of disbelief. "Mrs. Blackwell, you didn't make a hasty judgment. You made a deliberate choice to be cruel to a child and her father based on nothing more than the clothes we're wearing." The doors to the community center opened, and a professionally dressed woman with a press badge entered, followed by a camera operator. Behind them came a group of well-dressed men and women who moved with the confident bearing of business executives. The reporter, a woman in her 30s with sharp eyes and an authoritative presence, scanned the crowd before her gaze settled on Robert. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm Sarah Chen from Channel 7. Your assistant said there was a story here about corporate responsibility." Robert set Sophie down gently and straightened his shoulders. "Thank you for coming, Sarah. Yes, there's definitely a story here, though it might not be quite what you're expecting." The board members had reached the group now, and Robert could see recognition dawning on several faces in the crowd as they identified these prominent local business leaders. The chairman of the board, William Harrison, stepped forward with a concerned expression. "Robert, what's going on?" Karen's message was rather urgent. Before Robert could respond, Victoria made one last desperate attempt to control the narrative. "Mr. Harrison, I'm Victoria Blackwell. I believe there's been some kind of misunderstanding here. This gentleman has been claiming to be Robert Mitchell, but clearly there's been some mistake." William Harrison looked at Victoria with confusion, then at Robert, then back at Victoria. "Mistake? Mrs. Blackwell, I've worked with Robert for over 10 years. We have lunch every Wednesday. What exactly are you talking about?" The color drained from Victoria's face as the last of her hopes crumbled. Around her, she could hear murmurs from the crowd as people began to realize the magnitude of her error. Sarah Chen, sensing a developing story, gestured to her camera operator to begin recording. "Mr. Mitchell, can you tell us what happened here today?" Robert looked down at Sophie, who was watching the proceedings with wide eyes, then back at the reporter. "What happened here today, Sarah, is that my 7-year-old daughter wanted to donate her birthday money to help homeless families. When we arrived to make that donation, we were told we didn't belong here, accused of being charity cases ourselves, and eventually accused of running a scam." The camera captured Sophie as she stepped closer to her father, still clutching her decorated envelope. "I saved $55 for my birthday party," she said to the reporter in her clear child's voice. "But I wanted to give it to the kids who don't have homes instead." Sarah Chen knelt down to Sophie's level, her professional demeanor softening. "That's very generous of you, Sophie. Why did you decide to do that?" "Because having a birthday party is fun, but having a warm bed is more important," Sophie replied with the straightforward logic of childhood. The reporter stood and turned back to Robert. "And someone objected to your daughter's donation." "Not just objected," Robert said, his voice carefully controlled. "Mrs. Blackwell here suggested that we were running a con game, that I was using Sophie as a prop, and that security should remove us before we could steal from the actual donations." Sarah Chen's eyebrows rose as she turned toward Victoria, who was now visibly trembling. "Mrs. Blackwell, is that accurate?" Victoria opened her mouth, but no words came out. She looked around desperately for support, but Jennifer and Amanda had disappeared into the crowd, leaving her to face the consequences of her actions alone. William Harrison stepped forward, his face grim with understanding. "Mrs. Blackwell, do you realize that Robert Mitchell employs over 300 people in this community? That the Mitchell Foundation has donated millions of dollars to local charities over the past decade?" I didn't know," Victoria stammered. "And more importantly," another board member added, "do you realize that you just spent the last hour publicly humiliating one of the most respected business leaders in this region and his 7-year-old daughter?" The weight of her situation finally hit Victoria with full force. Her legs seemed to give out beneath her, and she sank into a nearby chair, her face buried in her hands. Sophie, with the compassion that only children possess, looked up at her father with concern. "Daddy, is the lady sad now?" Robert's expression softened as he looked down at his daughter. "Yes, sweetheart, I think she is. Should we help her feel better?" The question hung in the air, and even the news crew seemed to hold their breath waiting for Robert's response. Here was a moment that would define not just how this story ended, but what kind of lessons Sophie would learn about forgiveness and human dignity. Robert knelt down beside his daughter, speaking quietly, but knowing that the microphones would pick up his words. "Sophie, what do you think we should do?" Sophie looked at Victoria with the serious consideration that children bring to important decisions. "Well, she was mean to us, but maybe she didn't know any better. Grandma always said that hurt people sometimes hurt other people." Robert felt his throat tighten with emotion. Even after everything that had happened, his daughter's first instinct was compassion. "That's very wise, sweetheart. What would you like to do?" Sophie walked over to Victoria, who looked up with red-rimmed eyes. "Mrs. Blackwell, I'm sorry you're sad. Do you want to help give money to the homeless kids too? It might make you feel better." The simple offer of inclusion from the child she had tried to humiliate broke something inside Victoria. Tears began streaming down her face as she looked at Sophie's earnest expression. "I'm so sorry," Victoria whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm so very sorry. You're right to be sad with me. I was terrible to you and your daddy." Sophie patted Victoria's hand gently. "It's okay. Daddy says everyone makes mistakes sometimes. The important thing is to try to be better next time." The camera captured every moment of this exchange, and even the hardened news crew seemed moved by what they were witnessing. The story that had begun with accusations and humiliation was transforming into something entirely different. Robert stood and extended his hand to Victoria. "Mrs. Blackwell, my daughter is right. Everyone deserves a chance to be better. The question is, what are you going to do with that chance?" Victoria looked up at Robert's outstretched hand, then at Sophie's encouraging smile, then at the crowd of people who had witnessed her behavior. She had a choice to make, and everyone in that room was waiting to see which path she would choose. The afternoon sun continued to stream through the windows of the community center, but the atmosphere had shifted completely from where it had started. What had begun as a simple charity donation had become a test of character for everyone involved, and the resolution was still hanging in the balance. As Victoria reached up to take Robert's offered hand, Sophie bounced excitedly beside them. "Does this mean we're all going to help the homeless kids together?" The innocence of the question reminded everyone present why they had come to the community center in the first place. Not to judge each other or protect their social standing, but to help families in need. And in that moment, it became clear that the real story wasn't about wealthy executives or social humiliation, but about a little girl whose generous heart had the power to transform even the most difficult situations into opportunities for redemption and growth. The moment Victoria's trembling hand touched Robert's, the atmosphere in the community center shifted like the calm before a storm. But what happened next would prove that sometimes the most powerful revelations come not from those seeking vindication, but from the most unexpected sources. Sophie, still standing beside Victoria, with her characteristic blend of childhood innocence and surprising wisdom, suddenly tugged on her father's sleeve with urgent excitement. "Daddy, I just remembered something really important." Robert looked down at his daughter, noting the brightness in her eyes that usually meant she had discovered something significant in her 7-year-old world. "What is it, sweetheart?" Sophie bounced on her toes, her pigtails swaying with her excitement. "Mrs. Blackwell's name. I know that name from somewhere." She turned to face Victoria directly, her young face serious with concentration. "Are you married to Mr. James Blackwell?" Victoria blinked in surprise, temporarily distracted from her emotional breakdown by the unexpected question. "Yes, James is my husband. How could you possibly know that?" Sophie's face lit up with a brilliant smile. "He's the nice man who comes to read stories at my after-school program. He volunteers at the community center on Maple Street every Tuesday and Thursday." The revelation hit the assembled crowd like a thunderbolt. Victoria stared at Sophie with growing confusion and disbelief.
"That's impossible."
"James works at Mitchell Industries. He doesn't have time for volunteering." "But he does," Sophie insisted, with the absolute certainty that only children possess. "He reads us stories about brave knights and princess adventures. He's really good at making different voices for all the characters. Last week he brought cookies that his wife made for all the kids." Victoria's mouth fell open as she processed this information. "Cookies that his wife made?" she repeated weakly. Sophie nodded enthusiastically. "Chocolate chip cookies with little sprinkles on top. They were the best cookies ever. Mr. James said his wife loves to bake, but doesn't get to do it very often because she's always busy with important meetings and charity events." The camera crew, sensing an unexpected development in their story, moved closer to capture every word of this revelation. Sarah Chen gestured for her cameraman to focus on Sophie as the little girl continued her innocent revelation. "Mr. James always talks about how proud he is of his wife," Sophie continued, oblivious to the growing tension around her. "He says she works really hard to help people in the community and that she's beautiful inside and out. He told us that sometimes grown-ups forget how to be kind to each other, but his wife always tries to see the good in everyone." Victoria's face had gone completely white. The description Sophie was giving of her husband's conversations bore no resemblance to the man she thought she knew. James had never mentioned volunteering anywhere, let alone reading to children at a community center. And the idea that he would describe her as someone who always tries to see the good in everyone felt like a cruel joke given what had just transpired. William Harrison, who had been watching this exchange with growing interest, stepped forward with a knowing expression. "Mrs. Blackwell, I think there might be something you don't know about your husband's schedule." Victoria turned to him with confusion and growing dread. "What do you mean?" "James requested a flexible work arrangement about 2 years ago," William explained gently. "He asked if he could adjust his hours to accommodate some volunteer work he wanted to do with children." Robert approved it immediately, of course. "We've always encouraged our employees to engage with the community." Robert nodded, his own expression softening as he remembered the conversation. "James came to me personally to ask about the schedule change. He said he wanted to do something meaningful with his free time, something that would make a difference in kids' lives. I was impressed by his commitment." Sophie clapped her hands together with delight. "See, Mr. James is one of the nicest grown-ups I know. He always asks about our families and remembers everyone's names. Last month, when Tommy's mom lost her job, Mr. James brought extra snacks for him every day until she found a new one." The weight of these revelations settled over Victoria like a heavy blanket. Her husband, the man she had been married to for 15 years, had been living a completely different life than the one she knew about. While she had been focused on social climbing and maintaining appearances, James had been quietly dedicating his time to helping disadvantaged children. Margaret Henderson, the event coordinator, approached the group with a tablet in her hands and a strange expression on her face. "Mrs. Blackwell, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think you need to see this." Victoria took the tablet with shaking hands. On the screen was the Maple Street Community Center's website, featuring a photo gallery from their recent volunteer appreciation event. There, smiling broadly while surrounded by a group of children, was her husband James. He was wearing a simple t-shirt and jeans, his usually perfectly styled hair slightly mussed, and his face radiant with genuine happiness in a way Victoria realized she hadn't seen in years. "James won our Volunteer of the Year award last month," Margaret explained quietly. "The children voted for him unanimously. They said he was the person who made them feel most valued and heard." Sophie peered at the tablet and squealed with recognition. "That's from the pizza party." Mr. James was so happy that day. He told us it was one of the best days of his whole life because he got to celebrate with all his favorite kids. Victoria scrolled through more photos, each one showing her husband in a world she had never known existed. Here he was helping children with homework. There he was organizing art projects, and in another photo he was dressed as a superhero for Halloween, surrounded by laughing children who clearly adored him. Sarah Chen, recognizing the emotional impact of these discoveries, spoke gently into her microphone. "Mrs. Blackwell, it seems like you're learning some surprising things about your husband today." Victoria looked up from the tablet, tears streaming down her face. "I had no idea. He never told me about any of this. I thought he was working late or attending business meetings." "Maybe he tried to tell you," Sophie suggested, with the blunt honesty that children excel at. "Sometimes grown-ups don't listen very good when other grown-ups are talking about important things." The simple observation hit Victoria harder than any accusation could have. She began to think back over the past 2 years, remembering conversations where James had seemed excited about something, only to have her dismiss his enthusiasm with comments about more pressing social obligations or networking opportunities. Robert, watching Victoria's emotional journey with a mixture of sympathy and recognition, spoke quietly. "Mrs. Blackwell, I think your husband and I have something in common. We both believe that how you treat people when no one important is watching reveals your true character." Victoria's head snapped up at these words. "What do you mean?" "James volunteers with children from families that can't afford private after-school programs," Robert explained. "These are kids whose parents work multiple jobs, kids who might not have anyone at home to help them with homework or read them stories. Your husband chooses to spend his free time making sure these children know they matter." He gestured towards Sophie, who was now showing some of the other children her decorated envelope. Just like Sophie chose to give up her birthday party to help homeless families. They both understand that real joy comes from lifting others up, not from looking down on them. The comparison stung Victoria deeply because she recognized its truth. While her husband had been quietly making a difference in children's lives, she'd been focused on maintaining social status and judging others based on their appearance and economic status. William Harrison cleared his throat and addressed Victoria with careful diplomacy. "Mrs. Blackwell, I think it might be helpful for you to understand something else about your husband's position at Mitchell Industries." Victoria looked at him with apprehension, unsure if she could handle any more revelations about the man she thought she knew. "James is being considered for a significant promotion," William continued. "Robert has been watching his work performance and his character for months, preparing to offer him a regional management position that would nearly double his current salary." Victoria's eyes widened in shock. "A promotion? But he never mentioned..." "The decision was going to be announced next week," Robert added. "James has no idea it's coming. We wanted it to be a surprise recognition of his dedication, both to his work and to the community." Sophie, who had been listening to this conversation with the intense focus that children bring to adult discussions they sense are important, suddenly looked worried. "Does this mean Mr. James might get in trouble because his wife was mean to my daddy?" The question hung in the air like a sword over Victoria's head. She realized that her behavior hadn't just jeopardized her own reputation, but could potentially destroy her husband's career prospects and his ability to continue the volunteer work that clearly brought him so much fulfillment. Please, Victoria whispered, turning to Robert with desperation in her voice. Don't punish James for my mistakes. He's a good man. He doesn't deserve to suffer because of what I've done. Robert studied Victoria's face carefully, seeing genuine remorse and fear for her husband's well-being rather than concern for her own social standing. Mrs. Blackwell, I don't believe in punishing good employees for their spouse's actions. James's job and his promotion will be based solely on his own merits and character. Relief flooded Victoria's features, but Robert wasn't finished speaking. However, he continued, I think you need to understand the full impact of what happened here today. Sophie's trust in adults has been shaken. She came here excited to help other children, and instead she was taught that some people will try to hurt you for being generous. Sophie looked up at her father with concern. I'm not scared of helping kids, Daddy. Mrs. Blackwell was just confused about what's important. The wisdom in Sophie's response drew murmurs of admiration from the assembled crowd. Even after being publicly humiliated and having her generosity questioned, the 7-year-old was still focused on understanding rather than condemning. Sarah Chen, who had been documenting this entire exchange, stepped forward with her microphone. Sophie, you've been very brave today. Is there anything you'd like to say to other children who might be watching this story? Sophie considered the question with the seriousness she brought to all adult requests for her opinion. I think kids should still try to help other kids, even if some grown-ups act silly about it. And maybe grown-ups should remember that being nice is more important than having fancy clothes. She looked directly at Victoria with earnest concern. Mrs. Blackwell, would you like to come with me and Daddy to visit Mr. James at the community center next week? I think he would be really happy to see you there, and you could meet all the kids he talks about. The invitation was so unexpected and generous that it left Victoria speechless. After everything that had transpired, this child was offering her a chance to connect with the part of her husband's life she had never known existed. Sophie, Robert said gently, that's a very kind invitation, but Mrs. Blackwell might be busy with other things. But Daddy, Sophie insisted with the persistence that only children can maintain, Mr. James always says that family is the most important thing. If Mrs. Blackwell comes to visit, then she can see why Mr. James loves helping kids so much, and maybe she'll want to help too. Victoria felt tears welling up again as she realized that this child, whom she had tried to humiliate less than an hour ago, was now offering her a path toward understanding and redemption. I would like that very much, Sophie, Victoria managed to say through her tears. If you think Mr. James wouldn't mind, I would love to come see what he does there. Sophie beamed with satisfaction. He won't mind. Mr. James always says that the more people who care about kids, the better. And maybe you could bring more of those really good cookies. The laughter that rippled through the crowd was warm and genuine, a stark contrast to the mocking laughter that had characterized the earlier confrontation. People began to see Victoria not as a villain to be condemned, but as a woman who had lost her way and was being offered a chance to find it again through the eyes of a child. Dr. Patricia Wells, a child psychologist who had been attending the event with her own family, approached the group with a warm smile. If I may say so, this has been one of the most remarkable displays of emotional intelligence and forgiveness I've ever witnessed from a child Sophie's age. She addressed the news camera directly. What we've seen here today is a perfect example of how children can teach adults about the true meaning of empathy and second chances. Sophie has demonstrated that kindness isn't just about giving money to charity, it's about giving people the opportunity to grow and change. William Harrison nodded in agreement. At Mitchell Industries, we've always believed that character matters more than credentials. Today, a 7-year-old girl has taught all of us a masterclass in leadership and moral courage. Robert looked down at Sophie, who was now chatting animatedly with several other children about her upcoming visit to see Mr. James at the community center. His heart swelled with pride as he realized that despite all his efforts to protect her from the harsh realities of the world, she had developed an inner strength and wisdom that allowed her to transform conflict into compassion. "Mrs. Blackwell," Robert said, turning back to Victoria, "I want you to know that while I can't forget what happened here today, I'm willing to see it as a beginning rather than an ending." Victoria looked at him with grateful confusion. "What do you mean?" "I mean that Sophie has shown us all what redemption looks like," Robert explained. "She's given you an opportunity to learn about the man your husband really is, and to discover what it means to make a difference in children's lives. What you do with that opportunity will determine not just how this story ends, but how the next chapter of your life begins." Sarah Chen, recognizing that the story had reached a natural pause point, addressed her camera crew. "I think we have everything we need for now. This has certainly been an unexpected and inspiring turn of events." She turned to Robert and Sophie. "Mr. Mitchell, Sophie, thank you for sharing your story with us. I have a feeling this is going to resonate with a lot of people in our community." Sophie waved at the camera with enthusiasm. "Tell everyone that helping kids is fun, and that even if people are mean sometimes, you should still try to be nice back, because it makes everything better." As the news crew began packing up their equipment, the crowd in the community center started to disperse, but the conversations continued. People approached Robert and Sophie to express their admiration, while others spoke quietly with Victoria, offering words of encouragement and support. Margaret Henderson approached Robert with the tablet still in her hands. "Mr. Mitchell, I've been thinking about what happened here today, and I have an idea that might interest you." Robert looked at her curiously. "What's that?" "What if we created a new tradition for these charity events?" Margaret suggested. "What if we started recognizing not just the largest donations, but the most meaningful ones? We could call it the Sophie Mitchell Award for Generous Hearts." Sophie's eyes lit up with excitement. "Really? There would be an award with my name on it?" "Not just your name, sweetheart," Margaret replied warmly. "Your example. We would give it to children who show exceptional generosity and kindness, just like you did today." Robert felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Margaret, that's a beautiful idea, but I think Sophie might have some thoughts about the name." Sophie nodded seriously. "Could we call it the Generous Hearts Award instead? Because it's not really about me, it's about all the kids who want to help other kids." Margaret smiled at the suggestion. "The Generous Hearts Award it is, and I think our first recipient is standing right here." Victoria, who had been listening to this conversation while still processing her own emotional journey, stepped forward, hesitantly. "If I may make a suggestion, I think there should be an adult category as well, for people who need to learn how to have generous hearts like Sophie's." The suggestion was met with warm approval from the assembled group. William Harrison nodded thoughtfully. "That's an excellent idea. Perhaps we could call it the Second Chances Award, for adults who demonstrate the courage to change and grow." Sophie clapped her hands together with delight, and Mrs. Blackwell could be the first person to get it, because she learned how to be nice and wants to help kids with Mr. James now. Victoria felt overwhelmed by the child's continued generosity toward her. "Sophie, I don't deserve an award. I need to earn my second chance first." "That's exactly why you deserve it," Sophie replied with the unshakable logic of childhood. "Because you want to do better, and that's the most important part." As the afternoon continued, the transformation in the community center's atmosphere was remarkable. What had begun as a day marked by judgment and cruelty had evolved into something beautiful, a celebration of redemption, forgiveness, and the power of a child's generous heart to change adult perspectives. Robert realized that this day would become a defining moment, not just for Sophie, but for everyone who had witnessed it. The story would spread throughout the community and beyond, but its real impact would be measured in the changed hearts and opened minds of those who had been present to see kindness triumph over judgment. Victoria approached Robert one final time before leaving, her voice quiet but determined. Mr. Mitchell, I want you to know that I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to become the kind of person your daughter already thinks I can be." Robert nodded with understanding. "Mrs. Blackwell, that's all any of us can do. Try to be worthy of the faith that good people place in us." As Victoria walked toward the exit, Sophie called out after her, "Mrs. Blackwell, don't forget about visiting Mr. James next week. And remember to ask him about the story voices. He's really good at dragon sounds." Victoria turned back with the first genuine smile anyone had seen from her all day. "I won't forget, Sophie. And thank you for teaching me something important today." "What did I teach you?" Sophie asked with curious innocence. Victoria's smile widened as she found her answer. "You taught me that the best way to have a generous heart is to start by being generous with other people's mistakes." The wisdom in Victoria's response showed that Sophie's lesson had truly taken root, and as she left the community center, everyone present knew they had witnessed something extraordinary, the power of a child's love to transform even the hardest of hearts. The following Tuesday afternoon arrived with an unseasonable warmth that seemed to mirror the anticipation building throughout the community. Word of what had transpired at the charity drive had spread far beyond the walls of the Oakwood Community Center, carried by social media posts, local news coverage, and the kind of word-of-mouth storytelling that happens when people witness something truly remarkable. Victoria Blackwell stood outside the Maple Street Community Center, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped a large container of homemade chocolate chip cookies. For the first time in years, she had spent the previous evening in her kitchen, carefully measuring flour and vanilla, trying to recreate the recipe that had apparently brought such joy to the children her husband read to each week. The simple act of baking had felt foreign at first. Her usual routine involved catered events and restaurant meals, but as the familiar scents filled her home, she began to understand why James had spoken so lovingly about these small gestures of care. She had dressed carefully for this visit, choosing simple jeans and a comfortable sweater instead of her usual designer attire. The clothes felt strange against her skin, like a costume for a role she wasn't sure she knew how to play. But Sophie's words about fancy clothes being less important than kindness echoed in her mind as she checked her reflection one final time. The community center was a modest brick building that Victoria had driven past hundreds of times without ever really seeing it. Now, as she approached the entrance, she noticed details that had been invisible to her before. Colorful drawings taped to the windows, a small garden tended by careful hands, a handwritten sign advertising an upcoming book fair with proceeds going to local food banks. This was a place where people came not to see and be seen, but to contribute something meaningful to their community. Robert and Sophie were already waiting in the lobby, and Victoria felt a familiar flutter of nervousness as she approached them. Sophie broke into a brilliant smile when she spotted the cookie container, bouncing on her toes with excitement. "Mrs. Blackwell, you came, and you brought cookies." Sophie's enthusiasm was infectious, and Victoria found herself smiling genuinely for what felt like the first time in days. "I tried to make them just like the ones Mr. James described," Victoria said, offering the container to Sophie, "though I'm not sure they're as good as the ones he usually brings." Robert stepped forward with a warm expression that held no trace of the tension from their previous encounter. "Mrs. Blackwell, thank you for coming. I think this is going to mean a lot to James." As if summoned by his name, James Blackwell appeared from around the corner, leading a small group of children toward the main activity room. He was dressed in the same casual clothes Victoria had seen in the photographs, his hair slightly disheveled in a way that suggested he had been crawling around on the floor playing games. His face was animated as he responded to something one of the children had said, and his laughter rang out with genuine joy. When James spotted Victoria, his expression shifted to one of complete bewilderment. He stopped so abruptly that the children following him nearly collided with his legs. "Victoria, what are you doing here?" His voice carried confusion, but also a note of something that might have been hope. Sophie stepped forward as the unofficial ambassador of the group. "Mr. James, I brought your wife to see what you do here. She made cookies for all the kids, and she wants to learn about helping people just like you do." James looked between Victoria, Robert, and Sophie with growing confusion. "I'm sorry, I don't understand. How do you all know each other?" Victoria felt her cheeks flush as she realized she would have to explain the events of the previous Saturday. The story that had seemed so significant in her own mind suddenly felt petty and embarrassing when viewed through the lens of her husband's meaningful work. "James," she began hesitantly, "we met at the charity drive at the Oakwood Community Center. There was a misunderstanding." Robert placed a gentle hand on Victoria's shoulder. "Why don't we let Sophie tell the story? She's become quite good at explaining things." Sophie needed no further encouragement. With the theatrical flair that 7-year-olds bring to storytelling, she launched into a detailed recounting of the weekend's events, complete with gestures and different voices for the various participants. The children who had been following James gathered around to listen, clearly accustomed to story time in unexpected moments. As Sophie narrated the tale, James's expression shifted from confusion to horror to something approaching pride, as he realized how his young friend had handled such a difficult situation. When Sophie reached the part about her invitation for Victoria to visit the community center, she beamed at both adults. "And now Mrs. Blackwell is here to see why you love helping kids so much, Mr. James. Isn't that exciting?" James looked at his wife with an expression Victoria couldn't quite decipher. There was surprise, certainly, but also a vulnerability she rarely saw in him. "Victoria, you really want to know about this place?" The question carried weight beyond its simple words. Victoria realized that this was about more than just visiting a community center. This was about whether she was willing to enter the part of her husband's life that he had been living separately from their marriage. "Yes," Victoria said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I want to understand what makes you so happy here. I want to understand why these children matter so much to you." One of the children, a girl of perhaps 8 with pigtails reminiscent of Sophie's, tugged on James's sleeve. "Mr. James, is this the wife you always talk about? The one who makes the really good cookies?" James smiled down at the girl. "Yes, Maria, this is Victoria. And yes, she made cookies for all of you today." Maria turned to Victoria with the direct stare that children use when they're evaluating new adults. "Mr. James says you're really pretty and really smart. Are you going to read stories to us too?" Victoria felt overwhelmed by the simple question. "I don't know if I'm very good at reading stories to children." "That's okay," another child chimed in, a boy with gap-toothed smile. "Mr. James wasn't very good at first either. He used to read in his regular voice until we taught him how to make the characters sound different." James laughed, his earlier tension beginning to ease. "That's right, Marcus. You kids are excellent teachers." Sophie stepped closer to Victoria, her voice taking on the conspiratorial tone children use when they're sharing important secrets. "Mrs. Blackwell, would you like me to show you around? I know this place really well because I come here sometimes when Daddy has meetings with other business people." Victoria looked at Robert with surprise. "You bring Sophie here?" Robert nodded. "The Mitchell Foundation has supported this center for years, but I wanted Sophie to understand that charity isn't just about writing checks. It's about understanding the people and communities you're trying to help." As Sophie led Victoria down the hallway, chattering enthusiastically about the various rooms and activities, Victoria began to see the center through the eyes of someone who genuinely cared about its mission. The art room was filled with colorful creations that spoke of imagination and joy. The library corner held well-worn books that had clearly been loved by many small hands. The kitchen smelled of healthy snacks prepared with care rather than convenience. "This is where Mr. James reads to us," Sophie announced, pointing to a comfortable corner filled with cushions and beanbags. "He sits right there in the big chair, and we all gather around. Last week he read us a story about a dragon who was scared of heights, and he made the dragon voice so funny that Tommy laughed so hard he got hiccups." Victoria tried to imagine her perfectly pressed husband sitting in the worn armchair, surrounded by children, making silly voices and bringing stories to life. It was so different from the image she had of him in their social circle, polished, professional, carefully controlled. "Mrs. Blackwell," Maria said, appearing at Victoria's elbow, "would you like to see the pictures we drew of our families? Mr. James helped us make a display." Victoria followed Maria to a bulletin board covered with colorful drawings. Each picture was labeled with a child's name and featured stick figures representing their families. Some drawings showed traditional nuclear families, others depicted single parents, grandparents, or mixed families that spoke of the diverse backgrounds of the children who called this place home. One drawing in particular caught Victoria's attention. It showed a man in a business suit reading a book to a group of children, with the caption, "Mr. James is like family," written in careful first-grade letters. "That's my picture," said a quiet voice behind her. Victoria turned to see a small boy, perhaps 6 years old, with serious dark eyes and clothes that were clean but clearly second-hand. "It's beautiful," Victoria said softly. "Mr. James must be very special to you." The boy nodded solemnly. "When my mama has to work late, Mr. James stays with us until she comes. He says nobody should have to wait alone." The simple statement hit Victoria with unexpected force. While she had been focused on dinner parties and social networking, her husband had been ensuring that vulnerable children never felt abandoned or forgotten. James appeared beside them, having finished settling the other children with their afternoon activities. "David draws the most detailed pictures of anyone here," he said warmly, ruffling the boy's hair. "He's going to be an artist someday." David beamed at the praise before scampering off to join his friends. James and Victoria stood alone in front of the bulletin board, the weight of unspoken conversations hanging between them. "James," Victoria said quietly, "why didn't you tell me about this place? About what you do here?" James was quiet for a long moment, studying the children's artwork as if seeing it for the first time. "I tried to at first. Do you remember about 2 years ago when I started talking about wanting to volunteer somewhere? You said community work was important, but that we needed to focus on networking with people who could advance our social standing." Victoria felt a cold recognition settle in her stomach. She did remember those conversations, though she had dismissed them as James going through some kind of midlife phase that would pass if she ignored it long enough. "I thought you would find this place." James paused, searching for diplomatic words. "I thought you would find it beneath us. These aren't the kind of families that get invited to country club events or charity galas. These are working families, single parents, immigrants, people who are doing their best with limited resources. People like I used to be," Victoria said quietly, the admission surprising them both. James turned to look at his wife with shock. In the 15 years they had been married, Victoria rarely spoke about her childhood or the circumstances that had led to her focus on social climbing and financial security. "Victoria, what do you mean?" Victoria looked around the community center, seeing it now not just as a place her husband volunteered, but as the kind of place she might have needed as a child. "My family didn't have money when I was growing up, James. My mother cleaned houses to pay rent, and I spent a lot of afternoons in places like this, waiting for her to finish work." She touched one of the children's drawings gently. "I remember what it felt like to be the kid whose clothes came from thrift stores, whose lunch was whatever we could afford from the grocery store's discount rack. I swore I would never feel that vulnerable again." James stared at his wife as if seeing her for the first time. "You never told me any of this." "Because I was ashamed," Victoria admitted. "When I met you, I had worked so hard to reinvent myself, to become the kind of person who belonged in country clubs and charity galas. I thought if I could just get far enough away from where I started, I could forget about what it felt like to be looked down on." The irony of her confession was not lost on either of them. In trying to escape the judgment she had faced as a child, Victoria had become the kind of person who imposed that same judgment on others. "But watching Sophie on Saturday," Victoria continued, "seeing how she was willing to give up something important to her to help other children, it reminded me of something I had forgotten. There was a time when I understood what it meant to need help, to depend on the kindness of strangers." Robert and Sophie appeared in the doorway, having finished their own tour of the facility. Sophie immediately sensed the emotional weight of the conversation and approached with the careful instincts children develop when they recognize adult pain. "Mrs. Blackwell, are you sad?" Sophie asked gently. Victoria knelt down to Sophie's level, surprising herself with how natural the gesture felt. "I'm not sad, sweetheart. I'm grateful. You helped me remember something important about myself." "What did you remember?" "I remembered what it feels like to need help, and how wonderful it is when someone chooses to be kind instead of mean." Sophie nodded with the wisdom of someone far older than her 7 years. Sometimes grown-ups forget what it was like to be little. But that's okay, because kids can help them remember. Maria appeared beside Sophie, followed by several other children who had finished their afternoon snacks. "Mr. James, are you going to read to us today? And is Mrs. Victoria going to listen too?" James looked at his wife questioningly. "Would you like to stay for story time?" Victoria felt a flutter of nervousness mixed with anticipation. "I would, but I don't want to intrude on your routine with the children." "You're not intruding," Marcus said firmly. "We like meeting new people who want to help kids. And Sophie told us you make really good cookies." The afternoon that followed would remain etched in Victoria's memory as one of the most meaningful of her adult life. She sat on a small cushion beside Sophie, watching as her husband transformed into someone she had never seen before. His voice rose and fell with the rhythm of the story, changing pitch and tone for different characters, building suspense and delivering punchlines with the skill of a professional performer. The children were completely captivated, responding to his cues with gasps and laughter, calling out suggestions when he paused for dramatic effect. Victoria found herself swept up in the story as well, remembering the magic of being read to as a child. The way a good storyteller could transport listeners to entirely different worlds. When the story ended, the children begged for another, but James looked at the clock with the practiced eye of someone who understood the importance of routine and structure in children's lives. "One more short story," he agreed, "but then it's time for homework help and waiting for your families." As James selected another book, David approached Victoria shyly. "Mrs. Victoria, do you know any stories?" Victoria felt panic flutter in her chest. "I'm not very good at telling stories like Mr. James." "That's okay," David said seriously. "You could just tell us a story from when you were little. Those are the best kind sometimes." Victoria looked around at the circle of expectant faces and realized that these children were offering her something precious, the chance to share her authentic self rather than the carefully crafted persona she had spent years perfecting. "Well," Victoria began hesitantly, "when I was about your age, I used to go to a place very much like this after school. And there was a librarian there who read stories to us, just like Mr. James does for you." The children settled in to listen, and Victoria found herself telling them about Mrs. Chen, the elderly librarian who had made her feel special despite her second-hand clothes and free lunch tickets. She told them about the day Mrs. Chen had given her a book to take home, the first book Victoria had ever owned, and how that single act of generosity had sparked a love of reading that had carried her through difficult times. As Victoria spoke, she noticed James watching her with an expression of wonder and recognition. This was the woman he had fallen in love with years ago, before social anxiety and status consciousness had built walls around her heart. When her story ended, the children clapped with genuine appreciation. Sophie leaned against Victoria's shoulder and whispered, "That was a really good story, Mrs. Blackwell. Mrs. Chen sounds like she was really nice, just like you're being nice to us today." The afternoon continued with homework help, where Victoria found herself working patiently with Maria on her reading, while James helped Marcus with his mathematics. The work was simple, but satisfying in a way that Victoria's usual activities never were. There were no hidden agendas, no social calculations, just the straightforward need to help children learn and grow. As parents began arriving to collect their children, Victoria watched the reunions with new eyes. These were families who worked hard, who loved their children fiercely, who made sacrifices to provide opportunities they themselves had never had. They thanked James warmly for his time and attention, and several parents made a point of introducing themselves to Victoria, welcoming her to their community with genuine warmth. When the last child had been picked up, Victoria, James, Robert and Sophie found themselves alone in the now quiet centre. The evening light streaming through the windows cast everything in a golden glow that seemed to reflect the warmth Victoria felt in her heart. "James," Victoria said quietly, "I owe you an apology. I should have listened when you tried to tell me about this place. I should have supported you instead of dismissing something that was important to you." James reached for his wife's hand, squeezing it gently. "Victoria, I should have been more persistent. I should have insisted that you understand why this work matters to me." "Why does it matter?" Victoria asked. "Help me understand." James looked around the community centre, his expression thoughtful. "Because these children remind me of why I work in the first place. It's not about accumulating wealth or impressing people at dinner parties. It's about using whatever advantages I have to make life better for others." He gestured toward the bulletin board full of children's artwork. "Every Tuesday and Thursday, I get to see the world through their eyes. I get to remember that kindness is simple, that generosity doesn't require grand gestures, and that the most important thing any of us can do is make another person feel valued and seen." Robert, who had been listening quietly while Sophie dozed against his shoulder, spoke up. "James, that's exactly why we're offering you the regional management position. We need leaders who understand that business success means nothing if it doesn't translate into community impact." James looked at Robert with surprise. "Regional management? What are you talking about?" Victoria felt a surge of pride as she watched her husband process the unexpected news. This promotion was recognition not just of his professional competence, but of his character and values. "We'll discuss the details later," Robert said with a smile. "Right now, I think we should focus on celebrating what happened here today." Sophie stirred against her father's shoulder and looked up with sleepy eyes. "Are we celebrating? What are we celebrating?" "We're celebrating new friendships," Victoria said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "And second chances, and the power of children to teach adults how to be better people." Sophie smiled drowsily. "That sounds like a really good party. Can we have cake?" The adults laughed, and Victoria realized that this simple moment, sitting in a community centre surrounded by evidence of her husband's quiet generosity, planning cake with a 7-year-old who had changed her perspective on kindness, felt more genuine and satisfying than any elaborate social event she had ever attended. As they prepared to leave the centre, Victoria took one last look around the space that had become the setting for her personal transformation. Tomorrow, she would begin the work of rebuilding relationships and changing patterns that had taken years to establish. But tonight, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the peace that comes from aligning your actions with your values, and the joy of discovering that the person you used to be might still exist beneath the layers of who you thought you needed to become. 3 months later, the Oakwood Community Center buzzed with an energy unlike any previous charity event. The autumn decorations had been replaced with spring flowers, and the space hummed with conversations in multiple languages as families from across the entire metropolitan area gathered for what had become known as the Generous Hearts Celebration. Robert stood near the entrance, greeting arriving guests with Sophie bouncing excitedly beside him. His daughter wore a yellow dress with sunflowers embroidered along the hem, a gift from Victoria, who had spent weeks learning embroidery specifically to create something special for the occasion. Sophie's hair was adorned with a small crown made of artificial daisies, crafted by the children at the Maple Street Community Center during their weekly art session. The transformation in the community since that fateful Saturday had been remarkable. What had started as a local news story about a child's generosity had evolved into a movement that touched lives far beyond anyone's initial expectations. The video of Sophie's interaction with Victoria had been shared millions of times across social media platforms, sparking conversations about empathy, second chances, and the wisdom that children possess about fundamental human values. Victoria approached the entrance, carrying a large banner painted with bright colors and childish handwriting that read, "Welcome to Generous Hearts Day." Her appearance had changed subtly but significantly over the past months. Gone were the rigid designer outfits and perfect makeup, replaced by comfortable clothes that allowed her to move freely among children and practical shoes suitable for spending hours on her feet, helping others. "Robert, Sophie," Victoria called out with genuine warmth. "The children from Maple Street are so excited they can barely contain themselves. Maria has been practicing her speech all week." Sophie clapped her hands together with delight. "Is she really going to tell everyone about the book program?" "That's my favorite new thing we started." The book program had been Victoria's idea, born from her own childhood memory of Mrs. Chen's generosity. Working with James and the Mitchell Foundation, they had established reading corners in 12 community centers across the region, each stocked with new books that children could take home to keep. The program had grown beyond anyone's dreams, with local businesses donating thousands of volumes and volunteers spending weekends organizing mobile libraries for families who couldn't travel to the centers. James emerged from the main hall, his arms full of folding chairs that he was setting up for the afternoon's presentations. His face carried the relaxed contentment of someone who had found perfect alignment between his professional responsibilities and personal values. The promotion to regional manager had allowed him to oversee community outreach initiatives across the entire Mitchell Industries network, turning his volunteer passion into his primary job responsibility. "The families from the downtown center just arrived," James announced, slightly out of breath from his chair-carrying duties. "And Mrs. Patterson brought her famous cornbread for everyone to share." Sophie's eyes widened with anticipation. "The cornbread with the honey butter? This is going to be the best day ever." As the afternoon unfolded, the community center filled with families whose lives had been touched by the ripple effects of Sophie's original act of kindness. Children who had received books through the reading program performed skits based on their favorite stories. Parents shared testimonials about how the expanded community center programs had provided stability and support during difficult times. Teenagers who had participated in the new mentorship initiative presented projects they had completed with guidance from Mitchell Industries employees who volunteered their expertise. The centerpiece of the celebration was the presentation of the first annual Generous Hearts Awards. Margaret Henderson, who had become the coordinator for the entire regional network of community centers, stepped up to the microphone with tears in her eyes. "6 months ago, a little girl taught all of us that the value of a gift isn't measured by its size, but by the love and sacrifice behind it," Margaret began, her voice carrying across the packed room. "Today, we're here to celebrate not just Sophie's generous heart, but all the generous hearts that her example has inspired." The first award went to David, the quiet 6-year-old from the Maple Street Center, who had organized his classmates to collect spare change for a local animal shelter. David approached the microphone with the serious demeanor he brought to everything important, his voice clear and strong as he explained his project. "The dogs and cats need help just like people do," David said simply. "And Mr. James always says that when you help someone, it makes your heart bigger." The second award was presented to a group of teenagers who had started a tutoring program, pairing high school students with elementary children who needed extra academic support. Their leader, a confident young woman named Carmen, spoke passionately about the importance of education in breaking cycles of poverty and limited opportunity. As the awards continued, Robert found himself reflecting on how dramatically his and Sophie's lives had changed. The publicity from their story had brought opportunities he never could have anticipated. Publishers had approached him about writing a book about single parenting and raising generous children. Speaking bureaus wanted him to share their story at conferences about corporate responsibility and community engagement. But the most meaningful changes had been the quiet ones. Sophie's confidence had blossomed as she realized that her voice and actions could make a real difference in the world. She had started a weekly drawing class at the community center, teaching younger children how to illustrate their own stories. Her natural leadership abilities were emerging as she learned to organize group activities and mediate conflicts between playmates. Robert had also discovered talents he didn't know he possessed. His speeches about the intersection of business success and social responsibility had resonated with audiences across the country. The Mitchell Foundation had expanded its mission based on insights gained from working directly with community organizations, and Robert found himself consulting with other companies who wanted to develop more authentic relationships with the communities they served. Victoria stepped up to the microphone for the final presentation of the afternoon, her hands holding a special award that she and the children had designed together. The trophy was a ceramic heart painted with handprints from dozens of children, surrounded by words in multiple languages that all meant kindness. "This award," Victoria said, her voice strong and clear, "goes to someone who taught me that the most important transformations happen not when we try to change others, but when we have the courage to change ourselves." She paused, looking directly at Sophie, who was sitting in the front row with a puzzled expression. "Sophie Mitchell, would you please come up here?" Sophie looked at her father with confusion. "But Daddy, I already have an award. Shouldn't this go to someone else?" Robert smiled and gently encouraged his daughter toward the stage. "Go on, sweetheart. I think Mrs. Victoria has something special to tell you." Sophie approached the microphone with the careful steps of someone who wasn't quite sure what was expected of her. Victoria knelt down to Sophie's level, her voice soft but amplified by the microphone so everyone could hear. "Sophie, do you remember when you invited me to visit Mr. James at the community center?" Sophie nodded. "You were sad, and I thought meeting the kids would make you feel better." "It did make me feel better," Victoria confirmed. "But more than that, it reminded me of who I used to be before I forgot what was important. You didn't just invite me to visit a community center, you invited me to remember what it means to have a generous heart." Victoria stood and addressed the entire assembled crowd. "6 months ago, I was someone who judged people by their appearance and their possessions. I was someone who had forgotten that kindness matters more than status, that generosity comes from the heart rather than the bank account." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "Sophie didn't just give away her birthday money that day. She gave me something much more valuable. She gave me a second chance to become the person I was meant to be." The applause that filled the room was sustained and heartfelt. Parents wiped away tears as they watched their children absorb the lesson that even adults could learn and grow when they were open to wisdom from unexpected sources. Sophie accepted the special award with the grace that had become her trademark, but her response surprised everyone in the room. "Mrs. Victoria, I think you should keep this award," Sophie said seriously, "because you did the hardest thing of all. You changed your heart when it would have been easier to stay the same." Victoria felt tears streaming down her face as she realized that Sophie, even in this moment of recognition, was still thinking about others rather than herself. "How about we share it?" Victoria suggested. "Because the best generous hearts work together." The afternoon concluded with a community potluck dinner that had become the new tradition for these gatherings. Families who had never met before found themselves sharing stories and discovering connections across cultural and economic boundaries. Children who had been strangers that morning were making plans for play dates and collaborative projects. Robert watched the scene unfold with deep satisfaction, knowing that this was exactly what he had hoped for when he first agreed to support community center programs. The Mitchell Foundation's investment had grown beyond financial contributions to include genuine relationship building and mutual respect between people from different backgrounds. As the evening wound down and families began gathering their belongings, Victoria approached Robert with a proposal that had been developing in her mind for weeks. Robert, I've been thinking about something and I wanted to run it by you before I go any further with the planning. Robert looked at her with interest. Over the past months, Victoria's ideas had consistently surprised him with their thoughtfulness and practicality. James and I would like to host a summer camp program, Victoria continued. Something that would bring together children from different community centers for a week of activities focused on leadership, creativity, and community service. Sophie, who had been eavesdropping with the shameless curiosity of childhood, bounced with excitement. Like a camp where kids learn how to help other kids? That sounds amazing! Victoria smiled at Sophie's enthusiasm. Exactly like that. We could use the retreat center that Mitchell Industries owns up in the mountains. The children could do outdoor activities, but they'd also work on projects that would benefit their home communities. Robert found himself nodding as he considered the possibilities. That's an excellent idea, Victoria. What kind of support would you need from the foundation? Actually, Victoria said with a shy smile, I was hoping I could coordinate the program myself. I've been working with Margaret to get certified in youth program management, and I think this could be my way of contributing something meaningful to the community. The conversation was interrupted by Sophie tugging on Robert's sleeve with urgent excitement. Daddy, look! She pointed toward the entrance, where a familiar news crew was setting up equipment. Sarah Chen approached them with a warm smile and her characteristic professional confidence. Mr. Mitchell, Sophie, Mrs. Blackwell, Sarah greeted them warmly. I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but we wanted to do a follow-up story on how things have developed since our first report. Sophie practically vibrated with excitement. Are you going to tell people about all the new programs and the reading corners and the summer camp idea? Sarah laughed at Sophie's enthusiasm. If it's okay with your father, we'd love to hear about everything that's been happening. The interview that followed became a celebration of community transformation rather than a simple news story. Children spoke confidently about their projects and dreams. Parents shared how the expanded programs had provided stability and support for their families. Victoria talked openly about her own journey from judgment to understanding, and James described how his volunteer work had become his professional mission. But it was Sophie's closing comment that would be remembered long after the cameras stopped rolling. I think the most important thing we learned, Sophie said, looking directly into the camera with the serious expression she reserved for truly important statements, is that being generous isn't about how much money you have. It's about how much love you have in your heart and how willing you are to share it with other people. Sarah Chen smiled as she wrapped up the interview. Sophie, do you have any advice for other children who want to make a difference in their communities? Sophie considered the question with the careful thought she brought to all adult inquiries about important matters. I think kids should remember that grown-ups sometimes forget how to be kind to each other. But if kids keep showing them how it's done, the grown-ups can remember too. And then everyone can work together to help more people. As the news crew packed up their equipment and the last families departed, Robert, Sophie, Victoria, and James found themselves alone in the community center, surrounded by the evidence of an extraordinary day. The walls were covered with thank you notes from children, artwork depicting generous hearts in dozens of creative interpretations, and photographs capturing moments of connection and joy. Sophie yawned and leaned against her father's shoulder, exhausted by the excitement of the day, but glowing with the satisfaction of meaningful accomplishment. Daddy, do you think we helped lots of people today? Robert kissed the top of his daughter's head, breathing in the scent of her shampoo mixed with the lingering sweetness of Mrs. Patterson's cornbread. I think we did, sweetheart. But more importantly, I think lots of people helped each other today. Victoria approached them with a manila envelope in her hands, her expression holding a mixture of nervousness and excitement. Robert, there's one more thing I wanted to share with you. She opened the envelope and pulled out a thick stack of papers covered with letterhead from various organizations and businesses. These are proposals from companies who want to replicate what we've done here in their own communities. Apparently, our story has inspired people across the country to rethink how businesses can support genuine community development. Robert scanned the documents with growing amazement. There were inquiries from corporations in dozens of cities, all asking for guidance on how to develop authentic relationships with local community organizations. Several universities wanted to study their model as an example of effective corporate social responsibility. "Victoria, this is incredible," Robert said, his voice filled with wonder. "Do you realize what this means?" "It means Sophie's birthday money is going to help children in places we've never even been," Victoria replied, with tears in her eyes. "It means that a 7-year-old's generous heart has started something that could touch thousands of lives." Sophie stirred against her father's shoulder and looked up with sleepy eyes. "Are there going to be more kids who get to keep books now?" "Yes, sweetheart," Robert assured her. "There are going to be lots more kids who get to keep books." Sophie smiled with drowsy satisfaction. "Good, everyone should have books to take home." As they prepared to leave the community center for the evening, Robert reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. What had started as a simple act of generosity from his daughter had evolved into something far beyond anything he could have imagined. But the most remarkable aspect wasn't the scope of the impact. It was the reminder that meaningful change often begins with the smallest gestures from the purest hearts. The drive home was quiet, with Sophie sleeping peacefully in her car seat and Robert lost in contemplation about the future. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, more requests for guidance and support, and the ongoing work of nurturing the community relationships they had built. But tonight, as he carried his sleeping daughter into their modest apartment and tucked her into bed, with her favorite book on the nightstand, Robert felt the deep contentment that comes from knowing you've lived a day in alignment with your values. Sophie's generous heart had indeed changed their world, but perhaps more importantly, it had reminded everyone around them that the power to create positive change exists within each person, waiting only for the courage to act with kindness and the wisdom to believe that every gesture of love matters. Up next, you got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.